Hey everybody out there, this is Seto and welcome back to another History of Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode. Now today for you guys we are going to be covering October 2002 to February 2003. Now the reason we're covering this large chunk of space and time is because in December 2002 there was an emergency ban list that happened. However, nothing really happened after that emergency ban list. No product was released. Nothing was really happening until February 2003, which is why I'm covering the January part and the early part of February 2003, because nothing's really happening, but the meta hadn't really changed that much from December, necessarily because no new product was getting released. But that's what we're going to talk about. But right now, we're going to go over and just do a quick review of the October 2002 ban list, just so you guys get caught up. So starting on the screen right about now, you're going to just see rolling past you a list of the cards, the current ban list as it is for October 2002. Pretty much this is what the ban list looks like in October 2002. So let's go on to talk about, guys, the development of the competitive meta in Yu-Gi-Oh! At this time. How is the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Shaping up in October 2002 and in this era that we're talking about from October to February? So you're going to see a change from the beginning of this big format that we're talking about to February. It changes quite a lot. From looking through deck profiles in October, there was still a very casual mindset, and I was able to, which you'll see later on in this video, find historical decks that were actually created and made and played in tournaments at locals and whatnot in 2002. So October, December, January 2002, and 2003, I'm able to find deck lists now from people that were playing Yu-Gi-Oh! At that time, which is very hard to find, but thank you to Pojo for still keeping those old deck lists up. If you guys remember Pojo, you are most likely an old school player, but Pojo is an awesome forum from back in the day that we used to use for Yu-Gi-Oh! Content back before we had TCG Player and YouTube. So, yes, I was able to find old deck lists from back then and get people's thoughts on it, which were discussed in the deck segment of this video. But as I was looking through the deck list, I noticed that in October and November, there was more of a casual mindset for most players still. Everybody, even people topping their locals, it was pretty much this thing of they're still playing a Seto Kaiba, a Yu-Gi-Moto deck with other cards from the recent sets splashed into them. That is how most decks are starting to become. However, you start to see this trend from last time I was doing the videos to now, where you were starting to see this trend of people starting to play more competitively, using things like Forceful Sentry with white magical hats for hand-controlled things. You start to see this mindset starting to take form of people trying to be more competitive to win their locals more. People saying, well, this is working and this is not working, and I don't run this card for this card because this card doesn't help me that much progress my game state, while this card does progress my game state. So you start to see terminology start to be used. One of the first things you'll notice that will come out of this format's video is something called the Fairy Meteor Crush effect. This is literally, I think, the first time you see in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Terminology, besides the word staples, that a connotation, a word, a card is associated with an effect. And what I mean by that is the Fairy Meteor Crush effect, as I'll put the card up on the screen, came out in Pharaohs Servant, but what it was called what it did pretty much was it was a piercing effect. If your opponent's monster was in defense position, I did a piercing effect. And back then, if you're a player, you remember people saying, oh, my card has a Fairy Meteor Crush effect, all the way up until 2005, 2006, 2007. That meant my monster has piercing effect. But back then, we didn't call it piercing effect, we called it Fairy Meteor Crush effect. So you start to see this terminology of people using this lingo, this jargon in Yu-Gi-Oh! More. A Yu-Gi-Oh! Jargon is starting to form, like we call today scrubs and all this. That's not developing yet, but you start to see a Yu-Gi-Oh! Develop a jargon in this era right now, such as those cards, excuse me. But you start to notice also that the competitive scene starts to get more competitive. People are trying out new ideas. They're breaking away from beatdown necessarily, and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Seto Kaiba, ideas like Dark Magician and Blue Eyes and everything, and Beatdown being the second, the best deck. You're starting to see a turn from that to exploring new ideas, new creative deck builds, and things of that nature. So let's go over now, guys, the October 1st, 2002 Tournament Pack 2. Season 2, I think it was called. But yes, Tournament Pack 2 for the year. This I didn't cover on last week's video because I said I was going to leave it for this video today. But let's go over some of the interesting things that came out of Tournament Pack 2. Now, Tournament Pack 2 only had 3 notable cards, really, that I found on it. And that was Morphing Jar, which was used for deck out decks, deck out strategies, and if you had the card, you ran it because it could refill your hand and things of that nature. Later on, it will be used for Empty Jar deck if you had all those expensive cards and things of that nature. But, however, there was a misprint of Morphing Jar. At the same time, apparently, in the facilities that they were creating Tournament Pack 2, they were also creating Pharaohs Servant, which is kind of interesting. And if you notice, as I put a picture up right now, this is the best picture I could find, you'll notice that there's a misprint. If you look very, very closely, and if you type it into Google and whatnot, you will find people talking about this. There was a couple copies, a good majority. I know John Moore talked about this, and he has, I think, a copy of the card himself, or at one point did, or has seen it, that Morphing Jar had Jinzo in the artwork. There was a misprint. And if you look at the video, you can see a regular Morphing Jar and you can see a Morphing Jar with Jinzo in the background. Kind of like he looks very ghostly, like he's in the recesses of behind Morphing Jar, but you'll see the outline of Jinzo's face. That was a misprint that not that many people know about in the Yu-Gi-Oh community. And if you have Tournament Pack 2 Morphing Jars, check out to make sure that you don't have a Jinzo in the background, because if you do have the outline of Jinzo, you have a more rare card than you know. But that's something I just wanted to mention. The other card we had was Giant Red Sea Snake, which was used in Water Beatdown. That's about all that card was used for. And a card that I just love the artwork and the fact that it's like, I think I looked online, it's like a $20 rare card. I was like, dang, I didn't know you were that expensive, dude. But it's a card called Doka Rhoda, I can't pronounce this, Doki Rhoda Rider. Doko Rhoda Rider. I think that's how you pronounce it. Card's awesome. I guess people just like playing with old school cards that have people on motorcycles. I mean, what? What are they going to do in a couple of years, Dueling on motorcycles? That would never happen. It did. But yes, that's what we're going to talk about for the Tournament Pack 2. And now, guys, we're going to flip over to talking about Pharaohs Servant. Guys, we are now going to be talking about Pharaohs Servant. And on October 20th, 2002, Pharaohs Servant was released. Now, this set overall was a great set. However, at the time of its release, it was considered a weak set. Even with things like Jinzo and Imperial Order that are in the set, it was considered a weak set for its time, because from the bottom up, there really wasn't a lot of competitive viability with the deck, or was so thought. And when you compare Pharaohs Servant to things like Magic Ruler and Metal Raiders, which were game-defining sets and like leaps and bounds, increased the game and its speed and everything, Pharaohs Servant is in that. But if you look at Pharaohs Servant in the span of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, however, it's a good set. But for the time, it was considered a weaker set compared to the other sets that were already released. So I just wanted to mention that because I remember people talking about that way back in the day. But let's talk about some of the cards that came out that had impact on the game of Yu-Gi-Oh throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So number one, the one and only Jinzo, or as we know him sometimes, Jizno. Jinzo is a powerful card. You guys know that this thing would get limited very shortly after it's released, within a month, with the emergency ban list in December 2002. But the card, you guys know, all the way up to 2005, even past 2005, this card saw competitive viability. This card, for a very long part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, was considered the best one tribute monster. You would tribute one card to bring a Jinzo out. It was worth it because it shut down traps in an age where traps were used a lot more than they are today currently. Hand traps are not around. Traps that activate from the hand, like evenly matched, are not around. Traps being set in the back row. It's heavy back row, set 5, set 4, set 3 back row, pass, go. And then if you summon a Jinzo on them, dude, that's broken. So Jinzo, very powerful card. The other card that came out, which I want to talk about a little bit more too, was Thousand Eyes Restrict. Now, Thousand Eyes Restrict came out of this set, and oh my gosh, nobody used it a lot at that time. The only people that used Thousand Eyes Restrict at this moment in time were people using Magical Scientist for Magical Scientist FTK decks. That's the only thing that you will see Thousand Eyes Restrict in. When Megamorphosis comes out, which I'll put a picture up on the screen if I can find one right away, then this card will see compatibility. Then this card will be used in the meta more as it's intended to. And then you'll start to see it be used in the famous format that we all know and love called GOAT format in 2005. So this card's prime is not for now. It's not going to be used that much at the moment. But down the Yu-Gi-Oh road, down the Golden Brick Road, it will be used. We also have Call of the Haunted, which off and on was on the limited list throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. But overall, a very good trap card. A card that we still use to this day in different types of decks. Maybe not so much nowadays, but if you guys remember the days of Trevier and Altair and Stella Knights, people still used Call of the Haunted just a year or so ago. So it's still a good card that is used in certain decks even to this day. Buster Blader came out of this deck, which was iconic card, and now later on, years later, has its own archetype. But back then, it was just Buster Blader. And people really, I was looking at deck profiles, and people were actually side decking Buster Bladers because still, a lot of the kids at locals, they said, were using Blue Eyes and Red Eyes in decks. And Buster Blader was a counter to defeating those decks. So if they had a Blue Eyes and Red Eyes on the field and they could tribute off monsters for a Buster Blader, they usually won game, they said. So it was a side deck card, apparently, for young kids way, way, way back in the day against dragon-based decks. Legendary Fisherman also came out of this set, which would be used a little bit, mind you, in Water Beatdown, but not until Legendary Ocean comes out, necessarily. Then you also have Premature Burial, which we guys know this thing is broken. It was actually originally made to replace Monster Reborn. That's why Premature came about. But then Konami found out that Premature Burial is a little bit more broken than Monster Reborn. And then it got banned. But that's down the road. We also have Imperial Order, which you guys, this card, even with its errata, is good still, even in today's game of Yu-Gi-Oh! But back then, this is pre-errata that we're talking about. So pre the errata of Imperial Order. This is back when you could turn it off on either players. You could pay the amount of life points. Then when it came back to your turn, you could automatically not pay the life points and you could turn it off like that. However, from my detective work of looking at people back then, Imperial Order was not played when it came out, from what I can tell. Now, I don't know if it's because it was an expensive card and not everybody had access to it, but you would think Jinzo overall would be the more expensive card, and people were running Jinzos in decks. So like I would go through deck profiles from 2002 and early 2003, and I was finding Jinzo in just about every single deck that people had access to them. They said if they didn't, they would run Jinzo. But not once in any deck profile out of like 35 to 40 deck profiles that I looked through did I find a single Imperial Order being played. However, I know from doing research down the road that later down the road, within April and May and June and July and the summer and spring of 2003, you start to see Imperial Order start seeing play. So what I'm thinking is people at the time didn't know how to use it properly, or there was some, I guess, text that was messed up that people didn't understand how it worked properly, like you could turn it off and on. Like, okay, I paid the 800, comes back to my turn, I can turn it off. That way I can negate my opponent's powerful spells on their turn with a measly life point cost. So I'm thinking that people didn't know how to use it and utilize it effectively at that time, but later down the road they did. So that's what I'm thinking is the reason why I'm not seeing in deck profiles right now when I'm looking at them from October, November, December, January, and February. There's no Imperial Orders that I'm seeing. And if they are, they're putting them in the side deck, not in the main deck. So I just want to mention that, but later down the road, you see into 2003, you see it being played in the main deck at 1 of, straight up. So just want to mention that. We also have Noblemen of Crossout, good card. This came out in this set as a super. You have Magical Hats, which was used in Harpies and overall as an anime card that you saw play. You also saw a common card, which I was surprised this card is worth money, but if you have these in bulk, you have some money. Thousand Eyes Idol. This was used to make the fusion summon of Thousand Eyes Restrict, along with Relinquish. This card, as of me making this video, costs about $2. It's a common, even for unlimited printings. Thousand Eyes Idol is about $2 to $1.76. I don't know why, but this random vanilla common is worth money. If you have them, you got some money. We also have DNA Surgery, which was used in the side deck for multiple different formats throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. We have Chain Destruction, which was used. We also have Ceasefire, which is a pretty good card back then, but wasn't used at that point in time. Down the road, it was used. Goblin Attack Force, which would be used later on. Pretty good card. This would be used in more beatdown strategies. Some people would tech it in. Also, some people would use it for final attack orders, decks down the road. You have Parasite, which saw no use and no competitive play, but people did try using it at my locals, and they quickly found out it wasn't that good of a card. Then you also have Dust Tornado, which, with the limitations later on of MST, would see play as being the number 2 back row removal. You also have Time Seal, which was banned later on, and not banned at the moment because you could run it as a 3 of, and it was a common, but it's still banned to this day that I'm making this video. But broken card when we look at it with hindsight nowadays. Appropriate, which was used in Exodia decks, came out in this set. You also have Prohibition, which is still used to this day inside decks. So Prohibition, still a good staple side deck card. You'll notice there's a lot of good side deck tech cards that came out of this set. I've gone over about 3 or 4 of them already. You also have Gravity Bind, which was seen play at this moment, but from what I can tell, again, people are not utilizing these cards because they don't see the full potential yet. So the deck profiles I was looking at, nobody's playing Gravity Bind necessarily. Later on, as 2003 heads in, comes around, you start to see it being played more and more. But at the moment in time, people are not playing Gravity Bind that much because they felt that, I guess, again, it hinders my deck. Why would I run it? Mirror Wall came out in this set, which was a pretty dang good card. You also have Magic Drain, which was a good side deck card that I did see people side decking and main decking as a replacement for Magic Jammer. Gearfree the Iron Knight came out in this set with, if you guys know, Magical Library, Butterfly Daga, Elma, Exodia, that 3-card combo. Broken. Back then, nowadays it's not really that broken. You also have Noblemen of Extermination, which did see some play off and on. You have Pharaoh Meteor Crush, which we talked about earlier, the Fairy Meteor Crush effect, which meant piercing damage. You also have Backup Soldier, which was used. Excuse me, I misspoke about the other one, but Backup Soldier was the one used in Exodia decks. Limiter Removal, which was at 3 of for quite a while until later on that it got limited. It mainly got limited when you start to see Cyber Sister and OTK's decks floating around. I think that's correct. Because people are using Megamorphosis along with that to pay 500 life points, bring out a Cyber End Dragon, Cyber Twin Dragon, boost it up, and then OTK your butt. That's what people were doing. Then you also have Harpy's Brother, which is now called Sky Scout, but back then was called Harpy's Brother. You also have Morphine Jar number 2, which is banned, I believe, currently. Came out in this set, but nobody really used it unless you were playing deck-out decks. You also have 4-star Ladybug of Doom, which I was looking at deck profiles and people were actually using this in their side deck against beatdown strategies, they said. You also have Enchanted Javelin, which was used off and on. Insect Imitation, Imitation, I believe it's called, or Limitation. This card was used in Insectors back after Hornet and Dragonfly got hit to 1 of. People still played Insectors and they would play Insect Imitation in their decks for that. I know because I even used it after looking at competitive builds like in 2012-13 era. Then you also have Hayabusa Knight, which is a great card. This is a precursor to Mata the Zapper. Pretty much this card can attack twice. So you could equip it with the Axe of Despair, and you have a 2,000 beater that can attack twice. Pretty good with the 2-card combo there. You start to see these more 2-card combos of making people think more about how to use their Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and they're thinking outside the box more, as you'll see in the deck profiles in a second. And then lastly, we have Cold Wave that came out as a common. Nobody played Cold Wave. Nobody did. However, you should know that this card would definitely see play in Glad Beast format. Ha! Yeah, fudge that format. Yeah. But now, guys, we're going to go talk about the decks that came out in October and early November 2002. We're going to talk about those decks. So, guys, we're now going to talk about some of the decks that came out after the October 2002 ban list, as well as after the set with Genzo and everything got released. There's a couple of things I want to talk about, though, before we get into talking about the decks themselves. Number one, these are authentic decks that I actually was able to find. So starting now going forwards, I will be able to show you on the channel authentic decks from that time frame, that time period that we are talking about in that video. So these are actually from October 2002. So late October 2002, early November 2002. I found these deck profiles, or these deck lists, mind you, on Pojo. Some of you old school guys may remember what Pojo was before we had the Yu-Gi-Oh organization and all these other places that we have now for getting our information or just talking about Yu-Gi-Oh like TCG Player and everything. Pojo was the mainstay for talking about Yu-Gi-Oh up until probably 2013, 2014. So I was able to go through their archives and actually find authentic decks from 2002, which they still had up. And they were pretty much tournament reports for players back then. Now, from what I can find, there was no major regionals going on back then. Most Yu-Gi-Oh players, from what I can find, are playing in 30 to 40 man locals plus. So there'd be some locals I've been reading that they're saying like there was 50 players, 60 players at my locals, or 40 players at my locals playing Yu-Gi-Oh. I entered the tournament and I came in third place, fourth place, first place, second place, things of that nature. At the time in 2002, from what I can find, there are no major regionals going on. There's big tournaments at locals, and there's no YCS level events, which would later become to be known as SJCs, then YCSs later on. But there's no major events like that. The competitive mindset, as I was talking about earlier, is a lot different. It's not fully developed. As I go through this video, we'll talk about how you can see the players through their deck profiles are starting to develop this competitive mindset and think about how they value their cards and card economy a little bit. So we'll talk about that as we go to this deck profile. I've read the reviews about all the decks, their tournament reports before I did this video. I looked back on it to make sure I remembered everything correctly. So this one holds a special place in my heart. This is a deck profile from Springfield, Virginia, from a locals that I myself, back in the day, used to visit from time to time because this is only about 30 minutes away from my house. I remember going to this locals and I actually knew the guy that did this deck profile tournament, this tournament report. I haven't talked to him in, gosh, probably 10 years, but I remember him. And he used to be very good at the locals. But it's kind of odd to see his deck profile all these years later. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so funny. So I was like, I gotta do this deck profile because I know the guy, A, and this is from years ago. He played up until I think it was, what, 2013 after Dragon Ruler format. He kind of quit. But yeah, it's very funny to see this. So I had to do this for my buddy out there. So without further ado, let us get started. So he's running Dark Elf, 3 Legend, the Mystical Genie of the Lamp, 1 7-colored fish, 2 Witch of the Black Forest. I should mention that he got second place at his locals, he said, with this, which the locals I used to visit, one of my old locals in Springfield, Virginia. 3 Wall of Illusion, 1 magical white magical hat. He said he liked this card because he was able to rip opponents' cards out of their hand, and he liked
taking away cards from their opponent's hand a lot. That's why you see things like Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, Forceful Sentry. So he liked this card a lot for just ripping cards out of his opponent's hand once he had cleared their board. Just poke it in, rip a card. He also said he liked using Mass Sorcerer for that reason, because what he would do is he would clear your board, he said, through Fissure, through Darkhole, Regeki, and reoccur these cards through Magician of Faith, and then he would attack you directly with Mass Sorcerer and then draw a card so he could +1. So he was trying to work for his pluses, as you can see, which is the reason why he's running 3 Mass Sorcerer. You also see Cyberjar, 3 Maneater Bug, 3 Magician of Faith. Flip effects back then, guys, were a lot more faster than they are today, um, even faster than they were in GOAT format, because flip effects were a lot more prevalent because the game was so slow and grindy. When many duels last 15 turns, 10 turns even. You see Regeki, Dark Hold, Change of Heart, Monster Reborn, Snatch and Steal, Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, Forceful Sentry, Pot of Greed, 2 Heavy Storm, Soldier of Revealing Light, Fissure, Premature Burial, Monster Mirror Force, Wabuku, and 2 Trap Hole. That was his deck profile. He did have some interesting side deck techs, and I want to talk about them. You see Prohibition and Sandgan. Now, a lot of people are going to be Prohibition. We still use in the side deck today, which is kind of interesting. That all the way back then, people were using it as a side deck tech. But Sandgan, you may be wondering about. He said he was trying it out. He liked it in some matchups and not others. But a lot of things I've been finding out with a lot of these deck profiles from in the 2002 is 2 things. Number one, everybody ran a 40 card plus deck. Nobody I have found has run a 40 card deck. It's usually 41, 42. The reasoning and rationality I can find from most people is I have Pot of Greed. I know this is very, very bad, thinking back then, but you gotta remember, people are just starting to become competitive with these tournaments going around. So the mindset was then, if I draw Pot of Greed, you know, those 2 other cards in my deck don't mean anything. Bad logic by looking back with hindsight. Back then, I could see why people would think that. But a lot of people I see like 40 to 41 cards. Some people like 42 because it was called the Pot of Greed. The thought of Pot of Greed. If I draw it, I draw 2 cards. You know, it was kind of the mindset of I need as many cards in my deck because I don't know what situation is going to happen in this game. And people weren't properly using the side deck. Everybody I've seen, there's only a couple people that are properly side decking, and those are the ones that are winning tournaments. I'm noticing as well. I looked through like 60 deck profiles. The second thing is I want to mention before I get into this deck profile, which is amazing. Nobody's running Giant Soldier of Stone at this point. Giant Soldier of Stone, Aquamador, Mystical Elf, nobody's running them. It's all about Wall of Illusion. Wall of Illusion was superior because if they destroyed it, and it could stop an 18 beater because beatdown was prevalent, and also it could bounce it back to their hand. And even if it was destroyed, it bounces a card back to their hand if it's destroyed by battle. Thus, they've lost a normal summon in some way, shape, or form. So that's why people prefer Wall of Illusion over those 2,000 defenders. But this one is a fun deck that I love to death. It's one of my favorite decks, actually, from back in the day to play, and that is a Mahavelo deck. So he's running 2 Witch of the Black Forest because it can search Mahavelo and anything else really in his deck. Mahavelo states this card gains 500 attack for each equipped card equipped to it. So that means if I equip it with an Axe of Despair, it's 2,550. Plus the additional 500 attack it gains from being equipped means it's 3,050 attack. It's stronger than Blue Eyes White Dragon with 1 equipped spell of Axe of Despair, which is amazing. So 3 Mahavelo. I hope one day Konami makes a retrained version of Mahavelo. I would love that. 1 Mask of Darkness. He said he liked this card, which was kind of the counter to Magician of Faith. You see 2 Magician of Faiths, 3 7-colored fish, 2 Wall of Illusion, 2 Maneater Bugs, 2 Lajin the Mystical Genie. This is kind of a beatdown Mahavelo deck. Karibo, which was kind of an interesting tech. He said he liked it. It came in handy. 2 Summon Skull, 3 Axe of Despair, 1 Pharaoh Meteor Crush, which if you guys remember I was talking about earlier, Pharaoh Meteor, back in the day, people said this card has a Fairy Meteor Crush effect. That meant it had piercing effect. We don't use that terminology anymore. We just say it has piercing damage. 2 Malevolent Nuzzler, which was a good equip spell card next to Axe of Despair. So he's pretty much trying to equip Mahavela with, Fear Meteor Crush or another card in combination to create a piercing monster, a big piercing monster, which is amazing. 2 Fissure, Pot of Greed, 1 MST, Dark Hole, Regeki, Wabuku, Monster Reborn, 2 Horn of the Unicorn, which was a card another field's equip card that people did like. Soul Exchange, which was used for your Summon Skull, Mirror Force, Magic Jammer, and 2 Trap Hole. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Now we're going to go talk about the December 2002 ban list.
Guys, as you saw by looking at those decks from October and November 2002, you'll notice that people were still getting their cards from Pharaoh's Servant, and was pretty much they were trying to figure out what to do with some of these powerful cards. People that had the money and had opened the cards were playing usually Jinzo as a 3 of, Imperial Order as a 3 of, these staple cards that you saw coming out of the game. Exodia saw a rise with things like Backup Soldier as well through looking through these deck lists. But people were still trying to understand how to use these cards properly and correctly. And Upper Deck, who I should mention was running things over here for Konami in the early part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, was running the show and pretty much had what we would consider nowadays an emergency ban list. Back then it was just called a ban list. Nowadays we would consider it called an emergency ban list, just like we had in Pepe format, or recently we had with Spiral format. When Spirals were tier 0, Konami pretty quickly, after a week or a couple of weeks, they quickly banned stuff and limited stuff to help the format be more healthy. So you've seen these happen throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but this is pretty much the first emergency ban list that you ever will see. It is also the first list to change the status of a card from a previous list. So what I mean is things like Swords of Revealing Light, which was at semi-limited status, now gets changed to a limited status on this list. And cards that were already previously on the list are changed for the first time. So cards are moving on the list that are already on the list. So like nowadays when we have a card that is limited, it may go to semi-limited and then unlimited. That's called moving on the list. This is the first time that's actually happening. From a card that's already on the list, changing its status. So for the list we have things like Jinzo going from a from an unlimited status to a limited status. Morphine Jar goes from an unlimited status to a limited status. Witch of the Black Forest goes from semi-limited to limited. Card Destruction goes from semi-limited to limited. Limit Removal goes from unlimited to limited. Premature Burial goes from unlimited to limited. Swords of Revealing Light goes from semi-limited to limited. Call of the Haunted goes from 3 of to 1 of. Ceasefire goes from 3 of to 1 of, even though it just recently had come out, all these cards pretty much. Imperial Order goes from 3 of to 1 of. Morphine Jar 2 goes from 3 of to 2 of. It goes to semi-limited status. We also have Nobleman of Crossout going to semi-limited. Backup Soldier going to semi-limited. And that is all we have for the list. I'm sorry, I had to look on my phone for that for a second. But yeah, that list is very interesting. It's for the next couple of lists, you'll notice that Upper Deck, who was running the show of everything over here for Konami, like I was saying earlier, you'll notice that they're having like these kind of like, oh gosh, the game has gotten kind of messed up. We need to quickly limit this stuff or take charge and do things. And you'll notice even before cards get released, so when we look into the crystal ball of the future, you'll notice that cards are not even coming out for a month or two. Upper Deck is already hitting those cards before they're even out. That would be unheard of today. That would be like people saying Electrum Knight, some broken card is coming out in 3 months, 4 months, okay, from now. And 2 months before that card is released, Konami just says, all right, we are limiting this card before it even comes out. The only time I can remember this happening in recent memory is when we had a card called, I believe it was 6 Cents. When 6 Cents came out in the Joey's Legendary Collection, Konami automatically put it to a limited status. That's the only time we've ever had something like that happen in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! In recent memory for me. But that's what's happening. All these cards that you see on the screen are getting limited and hit. So yes, that is what's happening. We also have in December 2002, in December 20th, 2002, excuse me, we have something that really doesn't impact the game that much, but for nostalgic sake, it's something to mention. We have the McDonald's promo pack. So if you remember going to McDonald's as a kid and getting Yu-Gi-Oh cards, that's when this happens in December 2002. So on December 20th, 5 days before Christmas, we have the McDonald's promos. Now, there's not really that much to mention out of this set. The only thing we have that are really notable is that there was only one spell card and the rest were monsters in the set. Frog the Jam, which was its original name before I got eroded, came out of this set, which has always been the joke of the community that because it says it was the worst croaking, it was banned from the Sanctuary of the Frogs because of its bad croaking. Frog the Jam. And we also have Unizombie, or back then when it was called Three-Legged Zombie. And this later on became Unizombie as we guys know it, which is a good card in zombie.decks. So that's what's happening right now in December and early January of 2002 into 2003. We're now going to go look at some decks from that era after the December ban list, and I'll see you guys back in a bit. So guys, now we're going to look at some deck profiles from decks from after the December 2002 ban list. So let's get started, guys. You see we have 2 Sky Scout, which was back then called Harpy's Brother because of mistranslation. So this is back then was called Harpy's Brother. Your 3 Legend the Mystical Genie of the Lamp, your 3 7-colored fish, your 2 Dark Elf, which was used still in the meta. Like I said, these are all historical decks that I've found, like I've said multiple times. 2 Wall of Illusion, 2 Magician of Faith, 2 Man-Eater Bug, 1 Witch of the Bifrost, 1 Sangan. So you're going to start to see people run that. Some people will run double Sangan, some people will run 1 Witch. It just depends on your deck and what the player that's piloting the deck is doing. But these are all decks that topped at locals back then. 1 Cyberjar, 1 Jinzo, double Summon Skull, 1 Regeki, 1 Dark Hole, 1 Change of Heart, 1 Pot of Greed, 1 Swords of Revealing Light, 1 Premature Burial, 1 Monster Reborn. You see that he's not running any Heavy Storm, and the reason I get from that is from reading what this guy said, because Heavy Storm is at 2 of, but he's not running it. And the reason he said he was not running it is he like side decking it against people that run a lot of traps, but he didn't like it because he didn't want to destroy like his Axe of Despairs and his Rush Recklessly's, and I don't understand it completely. He said that mainly the things he was having trouble with was things like running traps, and he would usually be able to get the Jinzo out to stop the trap. So he didn't feel like heavy was necessary. He said that he felt Giant Trunade was better, which, I mean, whatever. I mean, different deck ideas and techs for different folks, I guess. But that's why he's got 1 MST and 1 Trunade. He also mentioned that he liked the Trunade because he could bounce back his equip spells, and then bounce back his opponents, and then he could push for game that way. And then he could reactivate his equip spells. So I guess, but that's what he said he liked doing. Because I was reading these off tournament reports. But you have Tribute to the Doom, 2 Acts of Despair, and then the Rush Recklessly is really cool tech. You have to think of this in the idea of like Honest or Colute later down the road. It's a quick play card that gives you 700 attack bonus, and you think, well, that's not that much, but if I'm attacking your monster and you activate this on me, I'm gonna be like, oh, well, when battle phase, fudge, I can't do anything. So this puts in work, he said. 2 Trap Hole, 1 Call of the Haunted, and 1 Mirror Force. The next step we're going to talk about is something I thoroughly enjoy playing. This is actually a deck back then I actually played around with, not right later down the road when with Gravity Bind and other level 3 monsters like in Clown Control and things of that nature. But we have 2 Dark Elf, 2 Ha'abusa Knight, which we were talking about earlier. This card can make a second attack during each battle phase, so it can put in a lot of work. We also have 3 Magician of Faith, 2 Man-Eater Bug, 2 Mahavelo, which works well with the Ha'abusa Knight with things like Axe of Despair and Malevolent Nuzzler. We have 2 Sangan, because Sangan was at 2, 1 Witch, 2 Wall of Illusion, 1 Jinzo, 1 Cyberjar, 1 Mirror Force, 2 Seven Tools of the Bandit, 2 Heavy Storm, 1 Swords, 1 Change, 1 Monster Reborn, 1 Pot, 1 Dark Hole, 1 Regeki, 3 Acts of Despair, 1 Malevolent Nuzzler, 1 Snatch and Steal. He was actually running Solemn Judgment as well, which was an interesting tech. He said it was a great card, and he thinks that people underestimated this card. Now, this is back in 2002, mind you. And he said that if he timed it properly, even though he was paying a lot of life points, it would win him games because it would stop opponents' big pushes. So, interesting that he's thinking ahead of the curve of board control and to some degree with Solemn Judgment. If he used it at the right time, it's good. So you can start to see how these people and these players are starting to develop this competitive mindset of like, ooh, if I use these cards at proper times, like Rush Recklessly, Solemn Judgment, well then it works out for me. So you're starting to see this mindset change in the player base. So 2 Solemn Judgment, 1 Wabuku, 1 Premature, and 1 Call of the Haunted. One of his tech cards he said for getting around Jinzo that I found interesting was Share the Pain that he ran in his side deck as a 1-of. He said this was an out to Jinzo. So yeah, that's interesting. And the last deck we're going to profile is one that it's the first one I really could find in a tournament report, and that is a Blue Eyes, or as he said, a Dragon Beatdown deck. So as you see here, you have 3 Lord of D, 3 Nimamamunga, which can be used for tribute fodder and to gain life points back, 3 Blue Eyes White Dragon, because why not? Trihorn Dragon, the dragon that everybody forgets that was a secret rare, Red Eyes, Jinzo, Lejeune for beatdown, Wall of Illusion, Magician of Faith, Maneater Bug, Sangan, Witch, Regeki, Dark Hole, Change, Snatch, Pot, your staple things as you see right here. You also have 2 Acts of Despair because he said he liked equipping this to his Lord of D to keep it alive more. 3 Lord of D, 2 Trapple, Call, and Mirror Force. So I hope you guys enjoy this, and we're going to head to the next segment. Guys, that's the end of this month's History of Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode. I hope you guys all enjoyed the episode. I wanted to wrap it up here very quickly because I know it's been a very long episode, but there was so much to put into this month's episode. And so much happening with an emergency ban list and everything back then that I was trying to cover a lot of ground and move on into 2003. So I hope you guys all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a big thumbs up down below and remember to subscribe to the channel for more awesome videos. If you guys also would like to support my channel and support me on Patreon and help support the History of Yu-Gi-Oh! Series as well, please go down to my Patreon account, which is down in the description below. Either way, thank you for the support, and thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Without you guys, I would not be able to make these videos. So, thank you guys for all this support. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time on the History of Yu-Gi-Oh! And remember, guys, till next time, take care, have fun dueling, good luck dueling, and I'll see you guys next time. Good luck dueling to all of you. Take care, everybody.